Quick announcements before the next talk starts. First and foremost, if you were waiting to sign up for the Intercept, which is the Game Boy Zelda multiplayer CTF thing, there's a couple more devices now available. Go see folks in the Hardware Hacking Village. Look for the Intercept signs. Additionally, not on the schedule, but at 8, hold on, it's been a long day. 6 p.m., there's a demo party in the Hardware Hacking Village. Also at 6 p.m. is the ham testing, and that's taking place in the Lockpicking Village. If you want to do ham testing, but you haven't signed up, I strongly recommend you do that now. Check the website for all the sign-up info stuff. Other than that, coming up next, we have Joe Rozner with Phishing, FIDO, and the Future of AuthN. Give him a warm round of applause. Thanks, Joe. Good luck.
Thanks. Am I good to go? Cool. Hello. Anyone rolling out FIDO at their workplace or otherwise right now? No one? Okay. Cool. So, if you haven't yet, there's a good chance this is probably going to be something that either you do or you have to do at your work, or a lot of the stuff that you end up doing just on your own is probably going to end up being related to this. So it's a good idea to get familiar with it. But in order to understand why this is so important, we need to know a little bit about phishing and the current state of the art in phishing. So most commonly, phishing is focused on two objectives, either credential capture or session capture. Credential capture allows an attacker to log in whenever they want, assuming there's no MFA or they can bypass the MFA. While session capture allows the attacker to access the account for the duration of the session without having to bypass MFA at all, because they already have a valid session. They can just log in, or they can just use that session on a new device once they've captured it. Session capture tends to be more useful because of the prevalence of MFA these days. It's just easier. If you do that, you don't have to do the bypass step, which can be complicated or can be a place to get caught. But both are extremely effective. And just to clarify, nothing that we talk about today mitigates a situation where an attacker is able to capture a live session. So while FIDO does protect against the type of attacks that this can allow, say I get malware on your computer and I pull the session that way, FIDO will not protect you against that. Yeah. So over the past decade or so, there's been a major uptick in the adoption of MFA for most enterprises and high security contexts. MFA is the norm now, not the exception. While there are many types of factors, the three most commonly that are used today in enterprise are SMS, OTP, and push. These are relatively straightforward and cheap to bypass. For all of these, and we'll see shortly how that works, they generally work because the factor itself is unaware of the service that it's registered to, and so it can be used on a service that it's not intended, like a phishing web page. So let's start with SMS. SMS is generally used as a lowest common denominator. It's probably not going to be super common in your enterprise environment, at least I hope not. But it is a common fallback for a lot of use cases because everyone has it. Everyone's got a cell phone. Maybe you have two. But it is available for pretty much anyone, and we know that you can use it. The way that it's generally implemented is as a random code. So a code is sent to you to your phone, and you enter that into the application. The application can then verify that the code that you enter matches the one that it sent. And if it does, then it lets you in and it passes. This factor relies on the assumption that only the intended recipient will have access to that code, because as the person that owns this phone, no one else should have access to this phone. It's password protected. It's my phone number. You can't have it. Aside from socially engineering targets for the code, SIM swapping has become an extremely common and cheap way to hijack a phone number. If you don't know what SIM swapping is, basically it's an attack where using some method, typically of social engineering or bribery or coercion of a person working at like a cell provider, like the cell provider of the target's phone, you call them up, you get them to reassign that number to your SIM, and then all of the numbers, all the messages come to you instead of them. It's gotten to be very, very cheap, like on the order of dollars to get it done. So if it leads to an attack where you can steal thousands of dollars or more, it's very cost effective, and it's a very easy to pull off attack these days. Once they've done this and they have a username and password, they can start the auth flow. You go to the website, you type in the information, hit the button that says send me that code, and the SMS comes to you, or the attacker rather than the user, and you just enter it in and you're good to go. Another extremely common second factor is OTP or TOTP. These come in two flavors, hardware and software. Both are implemented roughly the same, though they have a few small differences. These rely on having a shared secret that both the authenticator and the service have, as well as an algorithm that's being used. And so the user uses the authenticator to generate a code, enters it into the application, and the application can verify that it's the correct code by using the same algorithm that the authenticator used, as well as the same seed to generate a code. And because they're synchronized, they should line up within a time window, and it can verify that. For hardware OTP solutions like a YubiKey or the old RSA tokens that are super insecure and you should definitely not be using, those are generally hardened and non-trivial to extract the seeds. They may have hardened silicon. They may be tamper-resistant or tamper-evident, so that if you do get caught, it can wipe the seeds from it. For the software ones, like the one here, this Google Authenticator screen, the seeds are just stored on the device, typically in a whatever kind of security mechanism the device has. So it could be encrypted, it could not be. If you can access the device and you can extract the seeds, you can pull them out, and then you can bypass it by kind of doing that same sort of attack where I know the algorithm, I have the seed, I can also generate the token just like the application would and use that. In general, these, like a YubiKey, like, I don't know, this one, these are kind of expensive. So if you have to outfit your entire company with them, it can be a little cost prohibitive, especially if you have a team you need to ship them to. People have to carry them around, they lose them, they're not the most convenient. Most people end up adopting like a TOTP solution like Google Authenticator or Authy. They're all pretty equivalent, I think. It's also a standard, which is nice because anyone can build it, anyone can do it. And the last one we're going to talk about today is push. If you're in an enterprise setting, this is probably what you are using right now if you're not using FIDO, at least if you're at a large company. Push gained a lot of popularity for a number of reasons. It was really easy to roll out and really easy to use, especially for non-technical people. At the time it was built and rolled out, it was thought to be pretty secure. It was as good as any other factor that other people were using as a second factor. Your phone is typically one of the most secure devices you have, and so because of that, it's assumed to be secure. There's no standard for this, and so it's a product you need to buy. Duo, I think, is probably the most common and the most frequently used. When an MFA challenge is needed, the application tells Duo to send a push request out to the user. User gets the push request, they can accept or decline it. That usually sends some kind of message back to Duo, and the application can either receive a notification that it was accepted or declined, or they can go and poll Duo and say, did this happen? It works, reasonably well. Part of the issue with this, though, is that the request can be initiated by anyone. So if I've stolen your credentials, like I have your password username, I can log in and I can hit that button to send the push from anywhere, and it will get sent to you. Attackers have taken advantage of this by leveraging that exact type of attack and then using what's known as a push fatigue attack, where they just start hammering you with push notifications, and eventually you get annoyed and just hit accept and they let you in. It works surprisingly well a lot of the time, and has been, all these breaches we heard about last year and some of them this year, this was a major component in a lot of those. If you do happen to be using push as a second factor and relying on this to prevent phishing, CISA published an advisory in October of last year recommending the use of number matching. This is a feature that Duo offers. Okta has a push product as well. I don't know much about it. It's a feature that Duo provides. I don't know anyone else that does. But this basically provides a code on your screen, and you have to enter this similarly how you would use like SMS or OTP, and then it can verify that code matches. So it's just an extra step on top of that to make it a little more complicated. It doesn't actually break the attack. It just makes it adds an additional social engineering component to it that you have to be in contact with the target while they're accepting the push, so you can also get that code. So it's just more friction. It doesn't actually break the attack. So how are the attackers doing this? It's common to see statically cloned and semi-dynamic phishing kits used by attackers today, but the good ones have moved on to using these reverse proxy kits. If you've never seen one of those, there's a handful of them that are ready to use out of the box with configs for various SaaS applications. Most commonly, we have seen and used Evil Jinx 2, which is pretty common. There's a number of other ones out there as well, but they all more or less work the same. The attacker sends a target to a domain that they control, and what this does is it just hosts a reverse proxy effectively that does some manipulation of the data going back and forth. So user visits the reverse proxy, it reverse proxies to the real service, and all the data coming back gets swapped so that any URLs pointing to the real target get swapped out for the phishing domain, and cookies and all that get swapped. So user thinks they're talking with the real service, and it looks identical because it is the same data. But it's all transparent. You don't have to clone a website. You don't have to do anything. It's all dynamic. It works exactly the same as if you were talking to the real application, because it is. I mean, it really is the real application. It is pixel for pixel, identical, except for cases where your domain has changed. It works extremely well, and this allows MFA to function as it normally would because it's always sending the same MFA data to the real application. It's just proxying it. So if you have a push request, it's gonna go to the real application. If you have a TOTP code, it's gonna go to the application, SMS application. And using this, the attacker can intercept credentials, cookies, session information, and then just migrate that over to their own device. And if they go through the login process, they just log in and use that existing credential somewhere else. So we can see a quick demo here going to an Okta page that's definitely not a real URL for Okta. So the target types in their credentials like they normally would. They're presented with an MFA prompt and trigger it. The push notification is then delivered to the target where they can accept it. And this gives the actor credentials and a valid session for the real user. The user is redirected out to wherever you want to send them. It doesn't really matter. So by this point, a few things should be clear. Knowledge-based authentication is pretty bad, and most of the additional factors that we rely on to make it more secure can be bypassed fairly easily by a dedicated adversary for pretty inexpensively. So if you've been working around web security, there's a good chance you've probably heard some of these terms thrown around before. There's a lot of them, and they've all sort of been used incorrectly and interchangeably. So I want to go over a quick history of FIDO and add some clarification. This all began with two separate specifications, UAF, which was meant for passwordless authentication, and U2F, which was meant to provide a secure, phish-resistant second factor. UAF was implemented basically nowhere. I don't know of any service that supported it, and no browser I'm aware of actually supported it natively. U2F, however, did gain some adoption. Support began to appear in browsers around 2015, and by 2019, it was pretty widely supported. However, it was rarely made available as an MFA option because most services never implemented it. So this is based more on speculation than fact, but there's likely a few reasons why there was no adoption of U2F. At the time, U2F required dedicated security keys. You needed to have like a YubiKey. It wasn't built into the browsers yet, which most people didn't have. Most real people don't carry around a YubiKey with them. Push-based MFA was just becoming popular in enterprise, and consumer adoption was still not very high unless it was forced. Ready-to-use phish kits, like I talked about with Evil Jinx, they didn't really become popular or available until around 2018, and they weren't really popular until about 2019 or 2020. Customers didn't demand support, and so businesses, they didn't build it. And up until recently, it wasn't uncommon to charge extra for MFA for enterprise products. That was like an add-on. It was seen as a enterprise feature for some reason. So in 2019, the WebAuthN Level 1 spec was released by W3C, the standards body responsible for developing the standards that define the APIs that browsers implement. This is like the standards body that decides how all that stuff works in your browser and makes it so that it's generally compatible from browser to browser. This is where a solution begins to materialize that's actually usable. This includes support for both passwordless authentication as well as MFA, though there's still virtually no adoption of passwordless authentication by this point. By 2021, the Level 2 specification of WebAuthN is released, which is the current ratified standard. During this time, between 2019 and 2021, a small number of high-value target companies, such as Google and GitHub, begin to offer MFA support using what was U2F and is now WebAuthN as the implementation. I'm going to pause the talk here about WebAuthN before we get into 2022 and beyond to talk a little bit about how all this works. Then we can pick it up at the 2022 point and talk about where we are now and the future. So before we dive into how all this works, we need to understand a few terms so that we can all be on the same page. So a relying party or an RP, this is an application that uses WebAuthN. So like Google would be an RP. They are the application that I'm talking to and registering. I referred to these as services up until now, but going forward, I'm going to switch over to this RP terminology just because it's how they talk about it within the specification, and it's a little easier to, not mix and match terminology. Credentials are the key pairs themselves. WebAuthN itself, FIDO, uses public-private key cryptography in order to work. They come in two types defined by their storage modality, which we'll talk about a little bit. This is like a fancy word to talk about where the private key itself is stored. With discoverable credentials, or a resident key, as is known in previous versions, the RP, with discoverable credentials, the RP ID is stored on the authenticator itself, alongside with the credential. So it specifies the RP that it's for as well as the credential itself, and your authenticator has to store both of those. With non-discoverable credentials, the private key is encrypted using a private key in your authenticator, and then that is shipped over to the RP, and it stores it as the ID. So it never leaves the authenticator unencrypted. It's always encrypted in there. The nice thing about discoverable creds is it allows the authenticator to begin the authentication process without additional information from the RP. If you have a non-discoverable credential, the RP has to say, these are the credentials I know about for this user, and you have to tell the RP, like, oh, I'm this user trying to log in. The authenticator knows which credentials are valid for the RP because it can look up based on the ID. Oh, I'm going to Google. What creds do I have for Google? And so it can just start that process off and like, log you in. This has the downside of requiring storage for each credential on the authenticator. So if you have a hardware authenticator, like a YubiKey, you're limited to the amount of storage space on that physical device, which can be low in some cases. For non-discoverable creds, the RP needs to first identify but for non-discoverable, you can have an infinite number because the RP itself is storing them, and so the only thing you have to have is one key on your device that can do the crypto to encrypt the keys, and it just sends you back. So you get infinite number of non-discoverable. During the registration process, the RP can tell the authenticator which type of credential should be used. So if you're an RP, you can say, oh, I only want discoverable creds or I want non-discoverable creds, and it will follow that and do what it's telling it to. I've talked a lot about authenticators. They're basically this cryptographic entity that's capable of registering and asserting possession of an identity. Authenticators have a variety of characteristics, and RPs can specify, like I said, it can specify, I want this type of credential, or I want to require user presence, or I want to require verification of a PIN for accessing the credential. Depending on the use case, the RP may choose different characteristics, but it's expected that an individual authenticator only has one user. This authenticator belongs to me. Like, my YubiKey is mine. You don't use my YubiKey. Authenticators can come in two types. You have roaming and platform. Roaming authenticators are cross-platform devices, like a YubiKey is, meaning it can get moved from device to device. I take my YubiKey, I plug it into my phone, I plug it into my laptop, I plug it into my tablet. The identity goes with the YubiKey. A platform authenticator is implemented on the device itself. So my MacBook here, it has a platform authenticator in it as part of iCloud Keychain. Chrome has a platform authenticator built into it as part of the Chrome like password manager or something. It's built into the device. It's built into the software. An authenticator, it's the on-device ones can be implemented in a variety of ways. It could be implemented as like a password manager. It could be implemented in hardware like a TPM chip, secure enclave, trust zones. And it's kind of up to the implementation design to choose how they want to do that. There's also the credential storage modality. I've also talked about this already a little bit, between the difference between server-side and discoverable credentials. But in the case of server-side storage, the authenticator will encrypt the private key with the private key stored in the authenticator and then ship it up to the server. When it's time to log in, server just provides, these are all the keys that I know about, and it can decrypt those, or it fails to decrypt them if it doesn't know it. This is most commonly used with MFA workflows and has the benefit of being able to support an unlimited number of keys, which is nice. The downside is it leaves the authenticator, though it's never decrypted once it leaves, but it does leave the authenticator. So if there was ever a cryptographic weakness found in the algorithms used, that could be a problem, potentially. Client-side storage, historically known as resident key, now discoverable, stores it on the authenticator itself. And this is more commonly used for passwordless workflows for a variety of reasons. The term discoverable is used because the necessary information to determine which RP a credential can use is all locally, so it is discoverable based on the RP. The last characteristic is the authenticator factor capability. And this describes whether the authenticator is capable of verifying a single or multiple factors. So WebAuthn provides something you have factor. There is a private key that you have. It's a thing that you possess. Some authenticators are capable of providing additional verification, such as something you know in the case of a PIN or a password, as well as like a something you are in the case of like a biometrics. So if you have a fingerprint reader on your key, whether it's platform or roaming, it can do additional checks. Depending on your use case, whether MFA or passwordless, you may require that authenticator have, additional factors. And I'll show you like a matrix here that kind of walks through the different options. If you're using a username and password and using WebAuthn as a simple and secure second factor, the password's already provided this as something you know, and you don't necessarily need to have that additional check. So this is that matrix. This is the most common combinations of various characteristics. You'll notice that this covers 6 of the 8 possible combinations, if you can do some basic math. The other two can be combined, though the spec specifically states that it's generally not safe to do so, and so no one really does. But this kind of walks through on the left there, the authenticator type, how you would use it, and then which options you want in those cases. So now that we are all experts on some terminology, how does WebAuthn work, and how does it solve credential-based phishing? So there's 2 ceremony types that we're going to talk about: registration and authentication. Registration is the creation of a phish-resistant credential, whether passwordless or MFA, such as creating an account within RP. If I'm going to go create my new user on there. Authentication asserts that a specific identity is present, such as logging into the RP. The 2 ceremonies work more or less the same, whether they're being used in the passwordless or MFA contexts. But the RP will choose the characteristic combinations that we just discussed and present the options to the client, and the client will do the right thing, it's supposed to at least. So there's a handful of different registration scenarios, but this is the basic workflow. The user visits the RP and starts the registration process. The same way they would normally do it, you click the button, I want to create an account, and it prompts you for some information. The client identifies available authenticators. You can have many. You can have a platform one or multiple platform ones, plus maybe a roaming one plugged in. Information, including the RP's origin, is presented to the authenticator, which attempts to create a credential. If successful, the credential ID for the credential is returned to the client, which forwards it to the RP. So this could be, if in the case of a server-side storage one, it could be the encrypted credential, or it could just be an identifier that's provided to be used by the RP to know that it exists. This is provided to the server side, and it stores that, generates the account. In this case, the decrypted credential never leaves the device, and it should be only stored there. This is also it is bound to that RP as part of the process of generating that. The origin itself is bound to that key, and so that key can't be used for another site because it includes information about the origin. So the workflow for a discoverable versus a non-discoverable credential is a little different, so we'll cover both. In the case of a discoverable credential, the user visits the RP, begins the authentication ceremony. The client identifies authenticators that are available. Will typically require a user to either unlock or prove presence. So like I said, you might require someone to enter a PIN or use biometrics to unlock it. Once done, the authenticator will provide all known credentials for the user to select. The user will select the credential that they want to use, and it will sign an assertion that the client can send to the RP. Because the credential is bound to the RP, an assertion can only be made if the RP origin matches. This is how it breaks that phishing attack where you get sent to a domain that's reverse proxying. This is dependent on the client being correctly implemented, but it prevents sending an assertion to an RP that doesn't match. Again, like it's dependent on the client doing it correctly, but like use a good browser, use Chrome. I don't know, like just use a client you trust that like has smart people working on it, and it'll probably be fine. To authenticate a user, visit the RP. So this is for non-discoverable. To authenticate a user visits the RP to start the authentication process. Typically, this means like providing a username for like the account that you want to log in as, because for non-discoverable, the RP needs to know like who is logging in so it can send those encrypted keys back to the user. It looks it up, grabs those keys, ships them back. If it can decrypt them, it says, these are all the ones that I know about. Select the one you want. You select that. It uses that key to sign the assertion. Assertion goes back to the RP. RP validates it, and then it can, same origin checks, but it does the login process, and you're good to go. So this is great. We got a solution. It works. Why are we not using this? So there's a handful of issues that make it difficult or impossible for some cases. Like I mentioned earlier, adoption of FIDO and WebAuthN has been extremely slow. This started to change, but a lot of services just don't offer it. This is especially the case in the enterprise world where SSO is common and authentication isn't even handled by the services themselves. Up until recently, many SSO providers just didn't support it. And once they did, if you typically have to upgrade to a new version, which may not be compatible, other things, or it was a large project. When it has been available, it's generally been behind a gated feature, early access, or beta, or it lacked customer support. And so it just wasn't really built out to be used yet. If you did manage to have software that had widespread support, then you still have to solve the problem of authenticators. This is rough for individuals and incredibly rough for businesses. Up until around 2020, 2021, platform authenticator support was spotty at best. Some devices, browsers, operating systems supported them, but it wasn't widespread. I don't think anything on Windows supported like a platform authenticator, except for Chrome. I think both Firefox and IE and Edge just like didn't do it until relatively recently. You had hardware solutions like YubiKeys, which do work extremely well across platforms, whether you're on Linux or Windows or Mac or Android or iOS. Works pretty well, but these are kind of a hard sell. They're complicated, they're expensive, they require a user to carry them around, and they require training for people that are generally non-technical. Discoverable credentials, which are generally desired for passwordless, also require storage on the authenticator itself. Think about how many accounts you have in your password manager right now. Can you fit all of those on a YubiKey? A YubiKey 5C, like the most common one that we have today, this is like the current generation, that can store 25 discoverable credentials, which realistically, like maybe just your banking and like your email, like is like will like cover that. Like there's a lot of stuff. Furthermore, it's important that a user has access to Authenticator on every device they're going to use. So like if you have an iPhone, like you got to have a device that works with your iPhone. It kind of sucks because of Lightning. Hopefully Apple migrates over this year. The phishing problem itself isn't fixed so long as a non-phish resistant factor can still be used. So if you've rolled out FIDO at your company, but you still allow push because like you don't want to impact users, and some users may not have support for like some random device they have or some software they need, that person's still a target. They can still be phished because the attacker is just going to go back and fall back to push. They're going to fall back to TOTP because it's available. Like, why would you try to defeat the hard one when you can just go do the easy one? What this means is that practically a rollout can be expensive. If you have a large amount of variation in your devices, OS, browser that you need to support, you either need to wait for support across all of them or invest in hardware tokens. The devices themselves can be expensive, and you also need to factor in logistics of shipping, which can be complicated, especially if you have people across the world and need to get stuff to every single person. Yubico's done some to address this by providing a service that will drop ship keys to your employees. My understanding is it is very good. I don't know how much of the world it ships to, but I have heard good things about the support you get with it. You also run into the issue of needing generally 2 authenticators, and we'll talk about that shortly. If you don't want to go the roaming authenticator route like a YubiKey, you'll quickly realize that the concept of a platform authenticator is pretty murky. There's clear definitions of what one needs to do and how it needs to work, but they're all sort of implemented at varying levels of the stack, and outside of that, like, it needs to do these things or have these few characteristics, it widely varies for what the actual implementation looks like and where it works and what applications it works across and where it integrates and how it integrates. For instance, say you're using Chrome on your computer, and on your phone you're using like mobile Safari. In Safari, your platform authenticator is the iCloud keychain. In Chrome on your computer, it's the Chrome password manager keychain thing. Those credentials aren't going to sync across, at least right now. The people building this stuff have said that is not going to change. We'll talk about that. That is going to change, but it's still yet to be seen exactly how that's going to work and when it's going to work and be available. So maybe someday we'll get that. So kind of like unintuitive behavior and not really user-friendly, and explaining this to someone that doesn't know how any of this shit works, really fucking complicated. So, assuming you have devices, services that support AuthN and can deal with authenticators, you need to address registration. If these are all new users, it's pretty straightforward. They just sign up like they normally would. They go to the website, do it. If they're existing users, they can authenticate with a legacy credential, like their username and password, do their push, do their TOTP, and then from within there, they can go register. And then once they have, you can like disable push for those users or TOTP. Again, not the most trivial thing to do in a lot of cases. Like building up the policies and the configurations to allow that is generally non-trivial, especially at enterprise scale. And they also have to get these credentials onto all their devices. You have to solve that syncing problem if you're using platform authenticators. It kind of sucks. But what happens when you lose your roaming authenticator? How do you get back in? If you're an enterprise that uses SSO, you get one of your IT admins to go like reset their account and get them a new authenticator. It works pretty well. But for individual accounts, like if I'm just like logging into like my Gmail account, or I'm logging into like, I don't know, like my bank or something, like it's a little bit harder. Like if you're trying to get support with Google or, frankly any like company, not the most like ideal situation. The other problem is like what happens if you get a new device and you only relied on platform authenticators in the past? How do you get that credential from your old device to your new device? Especially if it's like not the same like type of device, it's kind of a hard problem to solve. Typically, the recommendation that we've heard so far is like have at least one roaming authenticator, like a YubiKey, because you can use that once it's been created to bootstrap a platform authenticator on any new device you have. That works pretty well. Kind of a bad user experience, not really pleasant, but it does work. But it's complicated, and for non-technical people, it's a pretty high barrier to entry. So while the web makes up a massive amount of the application ecosystem today, there is still a lot of native apps and mobile counterparts. These also need to authenticate. Many apps simply pop up a web view and take user through like a web-based auth flow. that leverages the session going forward. Depending on how this is implemented, like the web view itself is implemented, the embedded web view may not support WebAuthn APIs, and so you may just not be able to log in if that's the only option. For non-web-based auth, I haven't seen any native apps that talk to the authenticators yet. My understanding is that that's coming. I think at I/O, Google just announced some new APIs. I don't know where Apple is in that. There's a number of SaaS products that we've looked at, like while we were rolling this out, where it just didn't work, and so we had these companies that didn't want to give us an answer on like when it would be available, and so you're kind of at the mercy of them for when you can actually like move forward on this. So I don't know. Ironically, like Google's own applications don't work on Android, but they do on iOS. So there's a number of very public success stories out there, and probably many more that aren't as publicized. It's definitely worth reading some of these posts if you're planning to do this in the future. There's a lot of good insight, as well as how to avoid a lot of mistakes. In all these blog posts detailing the rollouts on the previous slide, there were a few commonalities. The first is that all these companies standardized on roaming authenticators as the primary auth factor. So having like a YubiKey, you can use like a platform authenticator, but having that standardized workflow that always works, really nice. All employees were given at least 2, so you have like a YubiKey plus a platform or a second YubiKey, makes it easier. If you lose a factory, you can use that to get back in and then get a new one. And then third, the rollout was done over a short period of time, migrating employees over completely and removing the option to use older insecure factors. So doing a very short-term rollout rather than a long-term to avoid that long tail. So as I mentioned earlier, we were stopping at 2021 when we were talking about WebAuthn. It's time to pick up where we left off. In 2021, there was a draft of the level 3 spec. This is mostly done to address a bunch of the things that we just talked about. Level 3 introduces 2 major changes: multi-device credentials, so syncing a credential across devices, and using your smartphone, which can be a platform authenticator, and using that effectively like a roaming authenticator. So like using my phone to log in on my computer as an authenticator. And these two were like the major enablers of what has become known as passkeys, and we'll talk about shortly. Platform authenticators are likely to win out for most people due to their cost, ease of use, and lack of desire to carry dedicated hardware around. Multi-device credentials are an attempt to solve 3 issues with platform authenticators: having to enroll all your platform authenticators into every RP to allow each of them to log in, bootstrapping an identity on a new device, and losing access when you lose a device. So what does this specify that the platform authenticator implements? What this does is specify that the platform authenticator implementers must implement support for multi-device credentials. It doesn't say how they're going to do it. It just says it has to exist. It has to be a thing that is provided. You have to solve that syncing problem. From a security standpoint, one of the selling points was device-bound for U2F. Having these hardened credentials in like hardened systems. These changes largely do away with that because people are going to be primarily on platform ones. But this is something that you can kind of sort of get back with some extensions to the standard. There's this concept of a device public key, which is a device-bound key that isn't synced. So you have this like multi-device credential that can move between your devices, and then a device-bound key that an RP can say, I want you to also have this key and sign with both of them as an additional thing. This is something an RP has to turn on and specify. It's not something that is like default. It's also not like part of the standard. It's like an extension. So whether or not your authenticator supports it, it may or may not exist, which means either you have to make it like optional or they just can't log in if they don't have one that supports it. During 2021, a number of companies, including Apple, Google, and Microsoft, all came together to develop what became known as passkeys. This was intended to create a common design that worked across platforms and completed the vision of bringing us to a phish-resistant, passwordless future. Passkeys are an implementation of the draft level 3 spec. It's important to note that WebAuthn level 3 is a FIDO specification, but passkeys are not a FIDO concept. It's an industry term that is an implementation of that specification. Passkeys focus specifically on the passwordless authentication aspect of FIDO, but can also be used just for MFA. It's kind of overkill for that purpose and is a better way to do passwordless. If that sounds like it solves all these problems with WebAuthn, you'd be right. The next question you might be asking is, how can I use it? And that's kind of a complicated question, and it sort of depends on the devices that you want to use, the OSs, the browsers, and the apps. Most platforms at this point have some level of support for WebAuthn, a platform authenticator available, and support for roaming authenticators. If you want to use a single device credential with hardware-bound keys, your only real option going forward is to use like a YubiKey. Currently, if you have macOS Ventura or iOS 16, it works out of the box with platform authenticators with multi-device credentials if you enable iCloud Keychain. You can't, however, use it without iCloud Keychain, so you have to sync. Chrome and on Android has made this same choice. It doesn't work that way on desktops. Many password managers are also developing their own solutions. 1Password and Dashlane, for instance, have announced their plans. Those will be coming out very soon. I believe Dashlane introduced some of their stuff at I/O a few weeks ago. With the release of, I think, Android 14 or 13, whatever the one that's coming out soon is, we'll see all these changes that are going to enable this. So with all that said, what are the problems remain and where are the future attacks going to be? I don't know for sure, but I do have some ideas. As I said, things are changing pretty quickly. Not so much for the RPs that have already implemented support, but for the clients and authenticators. Everyone is in a rush to implement passkeys because it's getting pushed by Google and Microsoft and Apple. What this means is that the existing single device credentials implemented with level 2 are going away. Part of implementing multi-device credentials is syncing, and this becomes an opportunity for vendor lock-in. Once you buy into an authenticator ecosystem, you're going to want to use the same one everywhere. If you're buying into their syncing solution, you need to ensure that they provide an authenticator for every device or OS that you're on. They've said that it's going to move between them, but it hasn't been announced how that's going to work yet, so remains to be seen. One of the things that a lot of security-conscious people were excited about with FIDO was the fact that we were going to get these hardware-backed credentials that couldn't be easily extracted. That future's largely gone. Passkeys and multi-device credentials have won and are going to be the future. Realistically, we probably weren't going to get them anyway for that same storage problem I talked about. Not that big of a deal. We can use the device-backed key extension if we really want it. We're still getting these really strong phish-resistant factors. And that's pretty good, and I think that we can accept that and be happy with that. We've accepted that platform authenticators are going to be the path forward for most people, for most uses. Generally, these are going to be implemented like a password manager. This means on-disk storage of encrypted material. There's a lot of current and past attacks against password managers that have allowed credentials to be stolen. There was that big thing with LastPass last year when they were hacked. Generally, this requires local access to the device on the machine. This will likely be a common attack vector and strategy for post-exploitation. As I've mentioned before, the only thing that WebAuthn level 3 or passkeys dictates is multi-device credentials have to exist, not how they do. Apple and Google have both released white papers providing some detail of how their system works and how it keeps your credentials secure. Details are a bit sparse for other vendors who are implementing passkeys. And they haven't really come forth and talked about that. All implementations won't be equal, and there will be opportunity to attack the implementation rather than the spec itself. One of the double-edged swords about WebAuthN specification is that there's tons of knobs, and RP gives you a lot of control to make it easy to shoot yourself in the foot. There are more secure environments, and you can do a lot of that, but you have to make the right choices, and that's hard to do. We've seen similar problems with JOTs over the years, where people use like ALG-NON or other like dumb mistakes, implementation details. We'll want to make sure that we don't do the same thing here. So, closing thoughts. The technology exists, and it's generally pretty good. Rollout is going to be painful for the next few years, at least probably. Vendor lock-in will continue to be awful, probably. Passwordless is going to be the future at this point. Bad vendors who won't prioritize support will likely continue to slow adoption and make this much more painful than it needs to be. And finally, phishing isn't fixed until we can turn off the non-phish resistant factors for everyone, because attackers will always just downgrade to the less secure option. And with that, I think I'm out of time. Cool. I got a few minutes for Q&A. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yes?
You went through like how it solves the phishing and all that stuff, but can you go ahead and like go through it one more time, like how it solved the reverse proxy and the man-in-the-middle attack?
Yeah. So the question is how it solves the reverse proxy and man-in-the-middle attack. Ultimately, the way that it works is that as part of the specification for like how FIDO2 WebAuthN works, the generation of the key itself is bound to the origin of the RP. And so you can't sign a challenge for a different RP. So when your browser goes to phishingwebsite.com rather than realwebsite.com, the attestation of that challenge will not work. It's just built into the protocol, basically. Yes?
Do you think that passwords are like another quote-unquote standard, or do you think it will actually revolutionize the passwordless authentication?
So the question is whether or not I think that passkeys will be a standard and revolutionize the industry. I mean, passkeys really are just an implementation of WebAuthN Level 3 and FIDO2. It is a subset of the standard, and it's designed for a certain subset of it. I don't think it will become a standard unto itself, but I think that Google, Microsoft, and Apple will say, if you want to build a passkey-compatible thing, these are the ways that you need to do it, and everything else will be handled by WebAuthN FIDO. They may, go the Microsoft route of extend, extinguish, whatever, and I don't really know long term. But the real goal is that they want these things to be usable between devices, so that, and I do think that there's little incentive to break compatibility, because people will probably just not use your version if it doesn't work with everything else they have. They'll use someone else's. Anyone else? Yes.
So looking at this, just basically, during the technical part, we're going to terminology, and there's about 50% of it, to be honest. And this strikes me as being, pardon my French, a convoluted clusterfuck. And unfortunately, it's like, at a technical level, if you look at something like TOTP, that works fine. It's not going to be intercepted the same way that SMS-based authentication is. Above and beyond that, once you've got the crypto right, which TOTP does, you're basically trying to patch user stupidity. And it's like, when you have a ridiculously complex standard like this seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, because again, I understood 50% of it.
Yeah.
You're going to end up with a lot of misconfigurations and compatibility issues, and moreover, the whole reason why you end up with security issues in the first place is because no one understands how the damn thing works. And if I'm seeing that talk put together by you and I can only understand 50% of it, that implies that anyone at some random company who tries to understand this won't get it at all. So the question is, given the complexity, do you see, first of all, is it reasonable to try and correct for end user stupidity or lack of education? And secondly, is it possible to misconfigure this badly enough where even if it's secure in the ideal implementation, you can still screw it up on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, so the question is about how easy is it to fuck this up and make it insecure? The answer to that is, I think it's pretty hard. Like you can turn a lot of knobs and you can make things more or less secure or require different like guarantees. But even in like the least secure option, it's still probably better than most other things out there. Now, as an implementer, and I should clarify, like, as an end user, this is all pretty easy once they start building support into, like, the browsers and the apps. Like it should not be complicated for the users. It should be complicated possibly for the people building, like, the RPs. And, like, so you're right, like, that does introduce opportunity to shoot yourself in the foot and make insecure choices. Some of that is we need to build good libraries that make it hard to do that. Some of it is, you're right, like the standard is very complicated and we should have made it simpler. I didn't write it. Standards writers are generally not very good at doing so, and I think it's unfortunate that they chose to do some of like the complexity that they did. I don't have a great answer for you besides that. But yeah.
How is, technically speaking, aside from making it harder for end users to screw this up, like, don't give the person the code over the phone, how is this a technical improvement over TOTP? Because as far as I can tell, that one has a greater hope of being standardized.
Yeah, I will follow up that off stage, but I need to get off here. Thank you. I totally understand. Thank you. I sped up much more because of that.
I didn't want to stress you out.